area of expertise is Arabic dialect contact and change between indigenous Jordanians and Palestinian refugees from the Gaza Strip. So of course he's the perfect person to speak to us about language contact and language change. And remember what he's telling you, because we're all going to create 2 group language modules, and one of them will have to do with language contact, specifically Arabic and Swahili. So this would be the basis of it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. I gave a talk earlier this week in front of 175 undergraduates, and this is a much more cozy environment. I was a little bit terrified, if I'm being honest, when I had to speak in a giant lecture hall, so this is great. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to try to talk about over the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll jump right into it. So Lisa actually said a little bit about me. I'll maybe say a couple more words about myself, but then I want to start going into actually looking at what language contact is, and then talking more about what happens when people are speaking to each other face to face if they don't speak the same language. Talk a little bit about where language contact happens, where it takes place, what some of the outcomes of that contact can be. And there are a number of different options for what happens when people come into contact, or different languages come into contact. Talk a little bit about some of the approaches to studying contact and what the people within academia who focus on this stuff, what they seem to think is most important. And I'll give you a preface that there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of argument about what's most important when it comes to language contact. We can't seem to agree. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end because I want to bring in some stuff about one kind of case study of contact that's happening in the Middle East. It's not Arabic and Swahili, but I think it will give you some practical examples of what some of the outcomes of this kind of process are that you'll in turn be able to use in the long run when you're working on those modules and stuff later. And then I'll wrap things up. So I'll say a little bit more about me. Like Lisa said, I am a joint PhD student in anthropology and linguistics here. Robin and I are actually in the same school of anthropology, although he and I have never met face to face until now. But I've heard him talk a couple of times, and I'm excited that I'm coming after him because I really like his stuff quite a bit. My research is specifically on dialect contact happening in Palestinian Arabic. So not necessarily contact between 2 entirely different languages, but different varieties of the same language. Specifically, I'm really focusing nowadays pretty closely on the Gaza Strip. I had a chance to go to Gaza in 2013 and do some research, and then this past summer, like Lisa mentioned, I was in northern Jordan working with refugees who are originally from the Gaza Strip, but now live in a refugee camp about an hour north of the capital of Jordan, and looking at how their variety of Arabic is changing over generations as a result of them being in contact with speakers of other varieties. And then kind of a long-term interest that I have, with a larger interest, is looking at language contact and dialect contact as one outcome of something like protracted political conflict in the Middle East, which is a political process that is unfortunately all too common in that part of the world, and it's not really something that we know a lot about, what the effects of that are for speakers of a given language or from different languages. So to kind of jump right into it, posing the question of what is language contact. So I'm drawing today pretty heavily from a book that Sally Thomason wrote, or Sarah Thomason. She's a professor at the University of Michigan. The book is called Language Contact. So if you find yourself particularly interested in what I'm talking about today, and hopefully by the end of this, maybe you'll all be linguists, I'll have converted you. I would really encourage you to read her book. It's very, very easy to follow, and it's not, it's not too dense of a read, and it's very accessible.
What was the name again?
Sarah Thomason.
Sarah Thomason?
Yeah, I believe she's now an emeriti professor at U of M. I'm not sure if she's still actually active on the faculty, but she is one of the foremost scholars of language contact, and she really kind of wrote the book on language contact. So if we're asking the question of what language contact is, she describes it as the use of more than one language in the same place at the same time. Right? Fairly straightforward and fairly simple idea. But there are a few really key points to make about that. So language contact does not require bilingualism or multilingualism or even fluency. And in fact, most contact situations, I would say, they come up in situations where there is a lack of bilingualism or a lack of multilingualism, or a lack of communication between different communities. But what it really requires is it requires contact from speakers of different languages. That's really the core idea behind language contact as a process. It also doesn't really necessarily require face-to-face communication from people. I'm going to spend the rest of the time after this slide talking about what happens when face-to-face communication takes place, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite. So one particularly good example of language contact that's happened historically but didn't necessarily require face-to-face communication are the influence of religious texts and the spread of religion throughout various parts of the world, right? One of the main ways in which Arabic got to most of sub-Saharan Africa is a result of the spread of Islam and the influence of Islamic text in that part of the world, right? So that's one of the ways that Arabic took hold in places like Africa and other places as well. But in the modern day, one thing that we often talk about when we talk about language contact are the influences of things like the internet, television, radio. These are all vehicles for language contact on some level, right? They all play some role in disseminating language to other communities, and there's a real potential for contact to happen, even if it's speakers of different languages. So that's a general idea of what language contact is. If I'm ever going too fast, just yell at me and say, Bill, slow down, why are you talking so quickly? Also I should say I'm happy to provide these slides at the end. I can forward them to Lisa and send them on. And I also have a couple of extra sources that I found that might be useful for you in the long run that I'm happy to forward as well. So moving forward from trying to address what language contact is and talking more directly about face-to-face contact. Language contact is really most often a result of that kind of communication. People actually interacting with each other face-to-face when they're speaking two or more languages in a specific geographic area. So we're going to come back to some of these examples, but really one of the most important examples of how language contact takes place are as a result of things like economic migration and trade. I'll probably mention it again later, but I mentioned it to Robin actually, and I'm sure he's very well versed in it. The Gulf in particular has been a main site of language contact as a result of its historic trade relations with other parts of the world. So you saw a lot of contact varieties of Arabic popping up in places like the Gulf, but other places as well. Slavery has also historically been a really strong vehicle of language contact. So historically we saw speakers of a number of different African languages that then came into contact with speakers of different languages here in North America, Central America, South America. African American English as a variety of English is partially a result of contact a long time ago between West African languages and varieties of English spoken in the coastal areas of the United States, right? So there are a number of different kinds of outcomes that stem from historic situations like that. Language contact as a linguistic process, it always has some kind of social history to it, but often we don't actually know what that history is. It can be pretty hard to locate where language contact started or what the factors were that first made language contact kind of get moving. But one case that's relevant to what you all are working on some level that we do really know where it started and where it came from. So across North Africa, as Islam spread out of the Arabian Peninsula, it came into contact with a lot of Berber and Tamazight languages across North Africa. So in places like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, we saw a lot of language contact happening there, and that's resulted actually in some degree of loss of Berber languages among those communities as a result of contact with Arabic. So that's just one example where we do actually know, what the underlying cause was of contact. We know where contact happened from a historical perspective, but a lot of the time we actually can't really trace its history as easily because it's just too far back or it's just too complicated for us to really pull it apart. Another important point is that language contact always has some kind of social consequence to it. When we're talking about people who are interacting face-to-face, there's always some kind of social outcome. It's inevitable, and it's a really, really important part of what language contact or what dialect contact is and what it entails on some level because of the actual the tangible experience for the people involved in their communication. So moving on from that, where does contact happen? Do you all have any sense of places where language contact may happen? I'd love to ask people questions.
Here?
Yeah,
Here, other parts of Canada mixed with French areas.
yeah. So you're giving some specific examples. We could also phrase this another way and say it happens literally everywhere. Really, there's not really anywhere where it doesn't happen in some sense. There's no language that we can ever identify that we can say definitively, this language developed completely in isolation. That doesn't really happen. You do sometimes see that in the news. I think in previous years you might hear that more of a community that no one had previously had any contact with, and people think that their language is completely cut off from the rest of the world. But really, when linguists actually look at those communities in particular, we still find that they have words that are borrowed from other languages, and there's not really a lot of basis to the idea that we can have a language that develops completely outside of interaction with other languages or speakers of other languages. Another example that often comes up when we talk about this kind of thing, Icelandic is often said to be a language that developed completely in isolation because it's very, very different than languages in other parts of Europe that are quite close to it and related to it. But actually the reason that Icelandic is so different is that the people that codified standard Icelandic as a literary language purposefully made it more archaic than the spoken language. So it looks to have been more isolated than it actually was. It was a design feature when people were codifying standard language. So language contact is definitely more intense though at certain times and in certain locations. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a couple of slides, but there are conditions that really make it ripe for language contact to happen and for some of the outcomes that I'm about to go into in a little bit to come to be. There are also some situations of language contact that are a lot more stable than others, and some of them are actually quite close to where we are now. So in certain parts of Southern California or in parts of Florida, you actually see English and Spanish being in fairly stable contact with each other, where they're both being spoken by respective communities and there's not necessarily really profound levels of change in either language, because they are actually quite stable in their contact, at least in the short term. It's hard to say what will happen in the long run, but based on what we know now, they're in fairly stable contact with each other. If you have questions at any point also, just feel free to shoot your hands up. The one thing that I really want to reiterate before I start going into the outcomes of contact and what happens when this process takes place is that language contact is very much the norm. It happens all across the world, everywhere, all the time, for various different reasons, and it has a number of different outcomes, but it is really one of the main aspects of being a human being that interacts with the world around you, some degree of language contact that takes place. So I want to jump now into some of the outcomes of contact, which can be really quite profound, and we're going to kind of go through them in their level of being profound, I think. There are three primary types. So the first of which is contact-induced language change, which is really what I work on. I work on it from the perspective of different dialects, but it's really the same general process. So language change that happens as a result of contact between multiple languages. Also language mixture, and we're going to go through each of these stages as I progress. But language mixture involves the development of something like pidgins and Creoles, if anyone happens to be familiar with that or have heard that term before, as well as mixed languages. And then finally, possibly I would say probably the most extreme example of what can happen as a result of language contact is language death. It's unfortunately common, and it's increasingly common as globalization has taken hold throughout the world. Language has unfortunately died out pretty quickly in a lot of communities. I think, if I remember correctly today, there are still over 5,000 or 6,000 languages spoken in the world, but I think that, if I remember correctly, the statistic is that the majority of them will be gone within 50 years, simply because the speakers are dying and they're not passing on the language to anyone else. So that is by far the most extreme outcome of language contact. So, starting with contact-induced language change. So, we can ask the question of what kind of change actually counts as being induced by contact or coming as a result of contact. Because language just historically changes all the time. Language is continually changing as we use it, as we're speaking to each other. It's going through a process of evolution. We certainly typically don't notice it in our day-to-day lives, but over time we can become pretty aware, and I could start giving you pop cultural examples of how language has changed, and I'm sure you could all come up with them as well. Thomason has a really nice quote about what kind of change counts as contact-induced. She says, any linguistic change that would have been less likely to occur outside of a contact situation, that's due at least in part to language contact. And you'll notice when I go through all this, there's a lot of, this is due at least in part, or we're not quite sure, we don't entirely agree on that. So there is a lot of back and forth in the scholarly literature and between academics about what some of these underlying factors are. When we talk about contact-induced language change, there are two primary types of contact-induced change that we usually identify. So the first are direct importations from a source language. Another way to think of that would just be the fairly common process of things being borrowed from other languages, right? So English has borrowed a ton of its words from various other languages. Spanish does the same thing. All languages do this to a certain extent. This is one of the most, readily accessible forms or outcomes of contact, is that kind of borrowing. Some more indirect effects of contact is usually how we talk about it. So we often talk about language attrition, something that takes place in languages that are going through a process of dying or not being spoken as frequently in their communities anymore. So if we're talking about attrition, these would be language changes that would be less likely if the contact situation hadn't occurred. So let's say two languages are in contact with each other, and one language starts losing some feature of its language. So it's an attrition-located change if we can say pretty definitively that that change wouldn't have happened had those two languages not come into contact with each other. And it's causing speakers to shift away from one language towards another. And a kind of crucial caveat here is it doesn't necessarily mean that they're shifting towards whatever other language they're in contact with. It doesn't have to be that. That can often be the case, but it's not a prerequisite, right? So I'm going to talk about this case in a little bit when we get to the case study towards the end, but they could be shifting towards another language entirely. The point is just that they're losing some features of their language as a result of contact. And then the second one, changes that were initially triggered by an importation. So this one is a little bit more subtle, and I think the best way to think of it is to think of it as the snowball effect, which we're often, I'm sure we're probably all familiar with that on some level, right? A snowball starts to roll down a mountain and all of a sudden it's gigantic or it causes an avalanche or something. The idea behind this kind of change is that at one point some change happens as a result of contact, but then after that, more change starts to happen as a result of the internal system of a language. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of a convoluted kind of idea, and it's a little bit hard to explain. But one way of thinking of it would be, let's say a certain sound gets borrowed from one language into another as a result of contact, and then the language that borrowed it, the way that its linguistic system is structured, the fact that they borrowed that sound requires that language to go through some other kind of change, right? So it's kind of a chain of different changes that all happen, but we can locate the initial change as a result of contact. Yeah?
When you're talking about language change, do you mean just in the oral language or also in the written form? Like changing alphabets or?
It can happen in the written form as well, so you do definitely see changes in things like orthography, the way that people are writing, potentially as a result of contact. I would say one particularly prime location where that kind of thing could happen would be in these really interesting trade situations historically, where people needed to come up with some kind of specific system to work out their economic business, but they didn't share a common language. So it can certainly happen in the written language as well, but what linguists and linguistic anthropologists I think typically end up focusing on the most are the changes that take place in the spoken languages. It's different varieties of spoken languages. But yeah, there's definitely no reason why it can't be in written language as well. So people feel okay with that idea? Okay, great. There's one caveat to this though. There's always more than one factor that causes language change, right? I'm starting to give you the outcomes now, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about factors, but there's always more than one thing going on. We can never definitively say, this is the thing that caused language change in this community. It's always a collection of different things that work together to get change started as a result of contact. So moving on to what has probably received the most attention when people are studying language contact are places of language mixture. So, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, there are three main types of language mixture that happen in contact situations. The first of which is pidgins, the second of which is the development of Creole languages, and then the third of which is the development of mixed languages. I'm going to go through each of those in turn and say a few words about each one. But collectively, this idea of language mixture, it leads us to the idea of a contact language arising. A language that exists solely because of contact with other languages, and it wouldn't exist otherwise had that contact not taken place. And Thomason has a particularly nice quote about this as well. She describes a contact language as any new language that arises in a contact situation. So linguistically, it's a language that's identifiable by the fact that its words, its lexicon, and its grammar, we can't trace it back to one single source language, right? If we look at a contact language linguistically, we see traces of all other languages, a number of other languages, and we can't say, yeah, okay, that's English, it's just a variety of English, or that's just a variety of Arabic, because we see too much stuff going on there. Okay? So, moving into pidgins and creoles, which in the Arabic case, there's been a lot of really, really fascinating research both throughout sub-Saharan Africa and the Gulf on the development of Arabic pidgins and creoles. So if you find yourself particularly interested, I'm happy to send along more resources on that because it's fascinating stuff. So pidgins and creoles naturally go together, at least to some extent. They share a lot of similar features, but they also have a number of key differences, and I'm going to try to go through and highlight all of those for you. They develop in social situations where there isn't really strong bilingualism or multilingualism between speakers of different languages, right? So situations where people of different linguistic backgrounds need to talk to each other, usually or often to do some kind of business. That's one of the primary reasons that these things come about. And they need to talk to each other regularly, but they don't actually have an easy means of doing so. So pidgins and creoles often develop in those situations. So what exactly are pidgins? So a pidgin language typically arises in a situation where there are speakers of more than two languages together, but they don't have a shared language and they need to communicate for each other. Like I said, often for economic reasons. So this comes back to the issue of trade. That's a reason why Gulf Pidgin Arabic is such a strong thing in the Arabian Gulf and places like Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain. We see a lot of that popping up because of the historically important trade centers that were in that part of the world. But people that need to communicate, they don't learn each other's languages for a variety of reasons, any number of reasons why they can't learn each other's language. So instead, a pidgin develops. So the vocabulary of a pidgin language is typically mostly from one of the two languages that are in contact. So if we say, let's say Arabic was in contact with a language from Southeast Asia, we could potentially say that one of the outcomes, if a pidgin developed, would be that most of the vocabulary was from that language from Southeast Asia, perhaps. So it typically draws from one language when it comes to its vocabulary, or predominantly from one language. But the grammar doesn't actually come from any one language. And what this really ties to with the pidgin language is that when the grammatical structure of that language is being solidified, a lot of it has to do with what grammatical forms are easiest for speakers to learn. So if you've got a situation where there are 4 or 5 languages in contact with each other and a pidgin is developing, what speakers end up doing is that the forms that are easiest for people to learn across the board are the ones that tend to win out, and those become the ones that make up the grammar of a pidgin. Does that make sense? So a lot of it has to do with simply what is easiest, what is most effective and efficient for the people that are going to be using the language.
Does this become formalized over time, or is it very informal and constantly changing?
So one of the main differences, and we'll get to this in a second, one of the main differences between pidgins and creoles is the extent to which these things are formalized. So there are 2 important things that really fall out from what I've said so far about pidgin languages. The first of which is that a pidgin is no one's native language. It's not spoken natively by anyone. It's always spoken as a second language in whatever community it's being used in. And it's used for pretty limited purposes, right? Because the way that it's structured, the way that the grammar is made up, it's basically taken whatever the most easiest forms are for people, and that's what constitutes the grammar. So it's often not as complex as a full-fledged language may be, so it can't necessarily be used for all the same functions. But it does serve very well for things like negotiating trade in these large areas where contact is happening. Another important thing that comes out of this is that, I think I just kind of mentioned this actually, they're pretty limited in linguistic material that they contain. Limited words, limited grammatical structure, right? So they don't have the necessary complexity for it to serve similar purposes as other fully fledged languages. Now, leaving pidgins behind, and when we get into Creoles, you can see that it does kind of shift a little bit. They're related to each other, definitely, but they are very different. So one of the main things about Creoles that you need to know is that a Creole does become someone's native language. A Creole is something that people speak as a first language. It's not only their second language. So they also do share a lot of similarities with pidgins, though. They're not entirely different either. So Creoles also arise in contact situations where we have speakers of multiple languages. They typically still draw their lexicon largely from one language, so most of the words still come from one language. And also they typically do still draw their grammars from multiple languages. So those processes that we talked about for pidgins are more or less the same when it comes to Creoles. But one of the main differences is that the domain of use for a Creole is much bigger. People are able to use a Creole for many more social functions and communicative functions than you would be able to for a pidgin. So a pidgin language can develop into a Creole over time. It can become more solidified, the ways in which it's used can be expanded, the structure can be expanded, and then we would say that it can become a Creole. But not every Creole language that you find in the world had a stage where it was a pidgin, which makes it a little bit more complex, right? So there are other ways that Creole languages can develop, one of which is that you can have a language, and then all of a sudden part of it, for any number of reasons or any number of factors can contribute to this, it can start to diverge. And if that happens for long enough and it gets to be profound enough differences, you can actually say that a Creole language is developed in kind of a reverse process, right, where one language becomes partially at least a Creole. So pidgins can become Creoles, but not all Creoles are pidgins. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a pretty simplistic overview of what pidgins and Creoles are, and like I keep saying, there is a lot of debate and a lot of argument about pidgins, about Creoles, about whether it's useful or not to make the distinction between the two, what they can be used for, what they can't. I just want to give you a general overview of what they are and some kind of general sense of what constitutes a pidgin versus a Creole.
Before we leave Creole,
yeah.
In New Orleans, I think the word Creole refers to like this unique language they have.
I don't exactly know a lot about Cajun Creole.
Cajun,
but from what I know, and don't quote me on this, I believe that Cajun Creole in New Orleans is a combination of French, like Louisiana French, and varieties of English spoken in Louisiana. There has been a lot of work done actually in recent years on language in Louisiana precisely for that reason, because it is a really, really interesting place where Creole exists in the United States. There are also, or there have historically been other places as well, like off the coast of the Carolinas, there were communities that historically spoke different Creoles. So it's not something that we can only associate with being like outside of the United States. They do exist here as well. We just often don't ever really think about them for the most part, because in our day-to-day lives we typically navigate the world in English. But they are here, and the Louisiana cases, it's fantastic. Yeah.
So because pidgins don't become full-fledged languages, they're kind of used in a limited context, do they become like the technical vocabulary, for example, terms for trade or terms for shipping, or is that where some of those words come from then, or from these pidgins that develop?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is dependent on specific communities and what each situation is like, because a pidgin is the development of each pidgin is a very, very unique unique thing, and it's very specific to whatever circumstances it developed under. But I would say that, like, if we take Gulf Pidgin Arabic as an example, you probably would see a lot of terminology that pops up or that, you know, evolved out of the development of that pidgin that comes to be used for things like trade.
Do they then die off? So if that industry shifts or changes, do the pigeons?
There's certainly the potential for that, yeah. I mean, at that point we get into a lot of larger kind of socio-political processes that happen. So, you know, I would feel completely comfortable saying that as globalization spreads throughout the world, through various parts of the world, you know, for instance, just as one example, languages spread throughout most of the world at this point. Things like that certainly bring with it the possibility for something like a pidgin to die out, given that it's used in such limited circumstances. So if there's that kind of contact with other, like, really strong socio-political forces or social forces in a community, then there's certainly the possibility for that kind of change to happen. But it's I can't give you like a definitive, like, yeah, that's definitely going to happen, just because it's so specific to each case.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, do pigeons tend to die off faster than Creoles? Like, do Creoles tend to have more staying power?
I would say that typically, yeah, that's the case, because keep in mind that a Creole has gone through a process of becoming much more developed. It's much more solidified in its linguistic structure, and it's used in much wider context. So as language is used in more and more contexts, it becomes more stable and more solid. So I would say that a Creole in general is probably more stable in the long run than a pidgin. But I would imagine if Sarah Thompson were here, she might be like shooting her hand up and being like, I don't know if I agree with you, Bill, because there's so much debate going on about pidgins and Creoles. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic fascinating linguistic thing. Like, it's a really beautiful process that happens in language, that these things develop. And it's one we don't often talk about. Okay, any more questions about pidgins and Creoles? Okay, so moving on to mixed languages. These are also really, really interesting, but they're a little bit hard to kind of define and wrap. It's a little hard for me to wrap my head around still, I think. So they arise in situations where we actually have pretty widespread bilingualism or multilingualism, so different than pidgins and Creoles that pop up in cases where we don't have necessary means of communication between groups. In this case, we do have them. We have multilingualism or bilingualism taking place, but it's typically in cases where bilingualism or multilingualism only really goes one way. We could think of it as like a top-down thing, where people do learn a dominant language or the main means of communication, but it's not necessarily a two-way street. So the speakers of the main language may not ever learn any of this other language that it's in contact with. And that's basically what I just say here. So some members of a group are able to use the main language of communication, but the other community doesn't necessarily do that. So it's kind of one way bi or multilingualism. So they don't actually have a need to develop an entirely new language because they can communicate in the main language. So they don't need to come up with a pidgin or a Creole or something. It's just not something that's necessary. But what often happens when mixed languages arise are that they serve pretty specific social functions. So I'll give you a couple examples of what those can be. So a lot of this stems from the desire or the need to have some kind of in-group language that serves as a means of communication within a specific group. So you could potentially think of this as something that serves a function of some kind of social solidarity between a group of people because they're able to use this language that is not necessarily the dominant language. One primary way that this happens is the idea of a language being used for kind of secret purposes. And I don't necessarily mean secret in some kind of like nefarious way. Secret in the sense that it's a way for people to communicate that's just not necessarily going to be understood by speakers of the dominant language. So one primary example of this is the language Anglo-Romani, which is spoken by some speakers who are of a Roma background in a place like the United Kingdom. So it's used as a secret language in that community, and it's acquired as a second language by the speakers of it. It's not their first language, but if you actually look at it linguistically, its grammar and the words are largely English, but there are enough words from Romani, the Romani language in there, that they're able to use it for a specific social function, right? And you may see some, you may see some kind of representations of this in popular media, like some movies that, depict gypsies. You'll often see something like this. I mean, this is like a Hollywood representation of it that only has some basis in actual real life, right? But the movie that comes to mind for me, if I remember correctly, was, I think, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. Has some of this. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that movie. There is some use of a mixed language that, if I remember correctly, involves Romani going on. But in this specific community, the example that I'm giving you, they use it as a means of communication that they can use without being understood by anybody else. So kind of a secret way of communicating. I experienced something somewhat similar this past summer when I was doing research in Jordan. The community that I was working in had both a lot of people who were originally from towns and villages in historic Palestine, what became Israel, and then also a lot of people who were historically Bedouin tribesmen. And they spoke a different variety of Arabic. And over again, they described to me that they primarily used their traditional Bedouin variety of Arabic as a way to communicate with each other without anyone else being able to understand them. Because it was quite a bit different than the other varieties that were spoken in that community. So they used it for a similar purpose. They used it as a way to communicate with each other somewhat secretly that most people just wouldn't be able to pick up on or understand. Yeah?
Or when you say secretly, probably less, more positively saying it would be privately or intergroup.
Yeah. It typically gets described as like a secret language in a lot of the contact literature, but I don't want to leave the impression
It sounds too pejorative. Right?
Yeah, I don't want to leave the impression that secret is necessarily like being used for some kind of devious purpose. That's not the case. I think it really ties back into that idea of creating some kind of solidarity within the group, and ties largely into the next point I think that I actually have up here. It serves as a symbol of identity for one particular group within a community, right? Their ability to use a language like this is part of what makes them who they are. It's part of their personal and community identity, right? So serving a private purpose like that, beyond just not being understood, it also serves, I think, a really important intimate function, within that community or within a specific family, right? They're able to communicate with each other in a way that they are really the only ones that are going to be able to understand that. And on a personal level, that's a very meaningful, idea, especially in a community where you're in contact with multiple other languages, right? The ability to have something linguistically that is very much your own, that is not part of the rest of that interaction, is pretty important. So I think you hit on a really good point there with that comment.
So is this what we would consider Spanglish here in Arizona? Like our high school students, they're creating a form of Spanish that isn't Spanish. Like they're making up or they're creating words.
Yeah.
And then they're struggling in their Spanish class because it's not actually Spanish, but it's this weird blend that they're making.
I don't know how the language contact scholars would treat Spanglish. So at my core, I'm a sociolinguist, so I care about things like this quite a bit. I would stop short of saying that it's necessarily a mixed language.
Okay.
I think, based on what I know of Spanglish in the US, I think that it's still at this stage where it's largely just particularly younger speakers being inventive in how they use their language. So I don't necessarily know that it's at that stage of really being a mixed language, but potentially it could. It certainly could. And I think maybe the potential for that is stronger in places where English and Spanish are less stable, like next to each other. I mentioned areas of Southern California and parts of Florida where it is particularly stable, but that's not the case across the entire United States, right? So when you have those differences, that's when there's potential for other things to start happening. Was there another question?
I was just going to ask, what are some other examples that you can think of that we might be able to connect to? Would Ladino be one?
I don't know enough about Ladino to necessarily say yes or no to that, so I'm going to stop short of that. I'm trying to think of some of the other examples that I've seen in the literature. So there are some varieties of Arabic that I've seen that have been considered a mixed language. I'm trying to think, so a lot of the varieties of Arabic that are spoken in Central Asia probably at this point would not be considered mixed languages, but perhaps they would. So for instance, in areas like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan perhaps a little bit, there are very small communities of Arabic speakers. Not a lot of people even know that they're actually still there because a lot of them have died out. But their varieties of Arabic at this point are very, very heavily mixed with languages like Persian. or Uzbek. So perhaps we could use that as another example where there's just been so much long-term contact that there's a lot of borrowing that happens. But I don't know that in that case it's used for the same social functions. So some of the stuff we've been talking about so far is that mixed languages serve some kind of really specific social function, and I don't necessarily know that that's the case with Central Asian varieties of Arabic. But I think that some of the other varieties of Arabic spoken in like sub-Saharan Africa could potentially serve that purpose. And if I see more on that in some of the literature, I can definitely forward it along to you all, because there's a lot of stuff out there about that. Okay, so the last kind of outcome of language contact, which is, like I said, by far the most extreme. There's a long quote from Thomason that I'm actually going to read because I think it's the most profound way of describing what the result of language death actually means. So she says that every loss of a language deprives us of a window into the human mind and the human spirit. Every language that dies deprives us of a unique repository of human experience and thought. Loss of a language deprives its speech community of much more because a large part of a culture must inevitably vanish with the language, right? So the idea is when a language dies, a large part of the community also dies with it because its culture goes out with the language.
Is that like Native American languages that?
Yeah, that's
Some
one of
them,
the,
I mean,
yeah, that's one of the most prominent examples of something like language death happening. I should say that this is often how it gets talked about in the contact literature as language death, but there is an important thing to be said for not necessarily referring to it as death, right? Because that carries with it some kind of social connotation. I know a lot of folks from indigenous communities here in the United States don't like to call it language death. It often gets called like dormancy. So language has just become dormant. So language death as a process, typically in its the most simple definition that I think we can come up with for it, would be that a language dies when it's no longer used for regular spoken communication with a community. So they're simply not using it anymore, and it just no longer exists as a spoken language. But that's a very simplistic definition, and there are a lot of problems that we could poke a lot of holes in that definition of language death. The first of which is, how do we handle that if there's one speaker left? Which is actually a very common occurrence in a lot of endangered languages. We get to the point where there is a single speaker left, but they have no one to speak it with. So at that point, is the language dead? Has it gone dormant? There's not a clear answer to that question, right? Also, who constitutes a speaker of a language? Another situation that's quite common in endangered language communities, as well as communities that are trying to revitalize languages, is that they don't actually have fluent speakers of the language, but they have people who are learning it as a heritage language or taking classes in it. The linguistics department here at the University of Arizona actually really specializes in this, and they work on Scottish Gaelic, which is spoken in parts of Scotland. And there are some native speakers of it, but a large portion of the population are learning it as a second language alongside English, right? So who constitutes an official speaker of a language, and particularly in these language endangerment situations? Do those speakers have to be fluent, or can we consider them speakers if they're not necessarily fluent? And also, who decides who is a fluent speaker of a language? There's an inherent kind of political side to that of who gets to determine who is a real official speaker of a language. So there are a lot of issues that come out of this when we talk about things like language death or language dormancy. And also, what about cases of language revival? The most prominent example, I think, of language revival that I can come up with is actually from the Middle East. Modern Hebrew. Hebrew was not spoken for centuries as an actual daily spoken language for a very long period of time. But early immigrants to what became Israel revived modern Hebrew as a spoken language. It's now transmitted across generations, and it's really, I think, one of the most prominent examples of how a language can be revived from some kind of dormant status, right? Hebrew was continually used as a liturgical language for religious purposes, but it was not spoken for a very long period of time until we saw things like people reviving it through using Yiddish and other Eastern European languages to build Hebrew back up as a spoken language. So that's another interesting question, is where do we locate something like language revival in this larger discussion? Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
So like, how do you deal with languages that are spoken for religious purposes, such as like Latin, but not as a widely spoken language?
Yeah. So Latin is largely considered to be a dead language. That's typically how Latin gets discussed, right? But it is a liturgical language. So typically, we would not classify a language as living if it's only used for that specific codified purpose. Often when we talk about like living languages versus dead languages, we're really locating that in the realm of like speech and interaction and day-to-day communication with people. So languages that are actually used to serve the social function that language serves beyond a liturgical purpose. Other questions? Okay. I've talked for about 45 minutes. I think I only have about 5 minutes or so left. I'm going to go really quickly through some of the approaches to studying contact and then wrap up with a really quick case study. So, like I've mentioned multiple times, there's this real debate within contact linguistics and contact languages about what's most important when we see language change happening, whether it's social factors that really matter the most in changes happening in situations of contact, or it's linguistic factors, so things that are internal to the languages themselves, not necessarily external in the world around them, or characteristics of the speakers using the languages. And like I said, they've got a very long-standing debate about which of these is really most important. So just a couple of points in kind of support of each idea. So Ruth King has argued that linguistic factors ultimately are the thing that is most important when we talk about outcomes of language contact. She says that the social factors involved in contact situations are important, but ultimately that has to be responsible, or it has to be tied to actual linguistic things and theories of grammar, right? So that's one way of looking at it. That's one way people deal with it. Sarah Thompson, who I've talked a fair number about, she kind of seems to argue a different thing, that social factors are really the most important thing. So the social relations between communities, not the structure of the language, are what determine the outcomes. I personally I feel more in line with what Sarah Thompson says myself, but that's because I'm an anthropologist and a sociolinguist, I think. And then finally, people have more recently started to ask the question, and I think it's an important question to ask, of whether change as a result of contact is necessarily a given, if it has to happen in a contact situation. And there is some evidence that that's not necessarily the case. And Shauna Poplack and Stephen Levy have said that contact-induced change is not inevitable, nor possibly even a common outcome of contact situations. And they've given a number of different points for that in their work about why they feel that we don't necessarily have to assume that change is going to happen as a result of contact. Yeah.
But isn't that getting at the intensity or how often you have the change? Because
Yeah.
that's the issue, right?
Yeah, I think so.
There's
Yeah.
some change, but how much?
Yeah, I think one of the really underlying things throughout this entire debate about the point, like what supports and what pushes language contact and change forward, more or less everybody is in agreement that we can't say it's definitely linguistic, it's definitely social, but some people are more willing to say, well, I think it's basically linguistic, but we should also pay attention to what people actually do as well. And then there are other people on the reverse of that, right? So it does stem from multiple different factors. So I'm going to try to wrap up here really quickly because we're already behind. I don't want to keep you from your lunch because I know that that's important. So I want to talk a little bit about these things as it relates to some of my own work, because I think it's good to contextualize that in a specific case for a minute. So Arabic and Hebrew in what is today Israel. I'm not going to talk here about the situation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip too much, because language contact is less common in those instances than dialect contact is. So we're going to talk about what's actually happening inside of Israel today between Arabic and Hebrew. So just a little bit of the background about this particular setting of contact. So prior to 1948, Arabic, Hebrew, and English were all used as official languages, primary means of communication. But prior to 1948, there was a larger population of Arabic speakers at the time. So following 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, we see a really strong shift towards the dominance of Hebrew as the main language of communication inside of Israel. Arabic is still an official language of Israel alongside Hebrew. But the situation that we have today is that government, education, the correctional system, the economic system, it all functions through the lens of Hebrew. It's all constructed through the use of modern Hebrew, which makes sense because the majority of Israel's population today are Hebrew speakers. But about 20% of Israel's population are ethnically Palestinian, and their first language, at least historically, was Arabic, although I think that perhaps may be starting to change. So speakers of Palestinian Arabic in Israel are often, at this point, at least functionally bilingual, because they have to navigate things like going to the DMV or applying for permits for things, any number of official things that all require them to have some faculty in Hebrew in order to conduct their daily lives, right? So there's widespread bilingualism among speakers of Palestinian Arabic in Israel. And actually, based on some of the research that my colleague Uri Horesh has done recently, a lot of people are now reporting that they actually feel more comfortable using Hebrew than they do Arabic, even if their parents were Arabic speakers. Yeah? Did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you had a question. So yeah, we can see where this situation is perhaps changing to the point where younger generations are using Hebrew more, even if older generations of their family were dominant in Arabic. So this system where Hebrew really is the dominant or the main language of communication has resulted in some pretty noticeable change within Palestinian Arabic spoken in Israel. So I read on the internet that you all are learning modern standard Arabic now, right? You've started? Okay, fantastic, that's good. I'm going to give you a couple of things. Oh, great. All right, well, we're going to talk about a couple of specific sounds from Arabic, and then I'm going to wrap up. But I just want to make sure, I wanted to confirm that what I read was correct and that you're starting to learn Arabic. I hope it's going well so far. So don't necessarily pay attention to knowing what lenition means necessarily. You don't have to write that term down. It's a very specific linguistic term. But what I want to say is, so the Arabic ayin, have you learned ayin yet? Okay, so
I tried,
yeah. No, it's like our favorite sound of Arabic. It's like one of the quintessential sounds of the Arabic language, and it's hard to pronounce, right? I was told to always overpronounce it. That's how you get it right, is you overpronounce it. Anyway, modern Hebrew lacks that sound. It's a sound that's historic to Semitic languages, but modern Hebrew doesn't really have it anymore. So as a result of contact between Hebrew and Arabic inside of Israel, Arabic speakers also appear to be losing that sound. So particularly, really young generations of Palestinians inside of Israel that have largely gone to school in an education system where they use Hebrew as a main means of communication, they appear to be losing that sound. So I can try to give you examples. I won't write them, I'll just say them. Hopefully you can hear the difference of what's actually happening inside of Israel with respect to this particular sound, because it's really, really interesting. So if we take an Arabic word like ba'din, which in Palestinian Arabic means something like after that. So I went to the movies and ba'din I went to the store. I went to the movies and after that I went to the store. So what we now see happening as a result of contact between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel is that the starts to go away. So there are a bunch of different options for how people are saying it now. So instead of ba'din, you can get ba'din, where there's like a pause in there. We call it a glottal stop if we're talking in linguistic terms. So ba'din versus ba'din. Can you hear the difference between the two? Okay. Another one is where they actually add an extra syllable in place of that consonant that's not there anymore. So instead of ba'din, you get ba'din. There's almost kind of a pause. Another one is where the vowel just gets elongated. The vowel is just longer. So instead of ba'din, you get ba'din. And then the last one, which is the most profound in linguistic terms at least, is they just delete that sound altogether. So instead of ba'din, just ba'din. That's it. And that sound's entirely gone. And that's happening at different levels within the community, at different rates, and a lot of it is tied to how much contact people have in their day-to-day life with Hebrew. So if they work in white-collar jobs, or blue-collar jobs, for instance, like mechanics, or people who work in restaurants and interact on a very regular basis with Hebrew speakers, they show much higher rates of losing that particular sound than people who interact much less frequently with Hebrew. Does that make sense? Cool. One other one that I'll run through really quickly. Have you gotten to the Arabic emphatics yet? So ta, sa, da, and va. Okay.
Those were those ones he put up there that are sounds you don't hear in English, right?
Yeah, we don't really have those sounds.
Those were those four, whatever you pronounce.
We often describe them as being like dark sounds, so vla versus the, ta versus ta. Well, as a result of contact with Hebrew, speakers of Palestinian Arabic are losing these sounds. They're losing the dark versions of those sounds. So ta, the emphatic version, is probably now much more like ta, right? So that's another change that's happening. And we know that that's a result of contact with Hebrew because Hebrew lacks those sounds. Yeah.
And a lot of words that have been borrowed from Arabic into Persian, they've also altered them too.
Oh, really?
For example, with that word that you said at the beginning, which I couldn't pronounce, in Persian they write it exactly like they do in Arabic, but they say badan,
Oh, really? I didn't
because
know
they
that.
don't have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That-
And they would write those letters, I was telling somebody today, but they changed them to Z's and S's
Yeah.
because they can't pronounce those sounds.
Yeah, actually, I was reading before I came today, I was reading a little bit about contact between Swahili and Arabic because I know that that's something that in the long run you all are interested in. If I remember correctly, Swahili does roughly the same thing with those sounds. I think they get replaced with s and z instead of being maintained. And one of the reasons that those things happen is that, for instance, the Arabic ayn, it takes a lot of effort to pronounce that sound. And what we're all trying to do on some level when we speak is make our lives easier for ourselves. So if a sound is particularly challenging for us to produce on a day-to-day basis, even if we're native speakers of it, you get things like that happening, right? Where it just starts to get, we often describe it as being weakened, right? Where it starts to kind of slip away. And that's what's happening here, but in this case, it's a result of contact between Arabic and Hebrew. So the last thing, borrowings, which is really one of the most common results of contact, like I mentioned a little while ago. A lot of Hebrew words are replacing common words in Palestinian Arabic. I don't remember the Hebrew word for it off the top of my head, but the kind of canonical example is that the Hebrew word for traffic light has largely replaced the Arabic word. And if we look at this in a different context, so in the West Bank, for instance, the Hebrew word for military checkpoint has replaced the Arabic word for checkpoint, largely in a lot of different communities. Right, so things that are very much a part of day-to-day life, like navigating a traffic light, people are starting to use words from Hebrew instead of words from Arabic. I want to wrap up. I was going to talk a little bit about the influence of Arabic on Hebrew, but the short version of that is that it's much more limited. We see very, very limited cases where Arabic is actually exerting an influence on Hebrew and causing some kind of change as a result of contact. The main thing is that people who are native speakers of Hebrew are using a lot of Arabic slang. So that's one of the main ways that contact has influenced Hebrew, is that you see a lot of Arabic slang popping up in modern Hebrew. So just run through that really quick. So to wrap up, just reiterate some of the general points. Language contact, I hope I've given you the impression, is extremely complex. There's a lot happening, and it's often pretty hard to pin down what the sources are and the factors involved. And like I said, there's virtually always one source of contact-induced change. We can never definitively say it was just this one thing that resulted in change. There's always more going on. And there are a lot of different outcomes, like I showed you, depending on the conditions under which that contact is taking place. And finally, we can't make up our mind about what we think about it, and we continue to argue about it. So I want to leave it there. I've got some references on here. Like I said, I'm happy to provide the slides. I've got a couple other PDFs that I can share that a colleague of mine, actually the colleague of mine that I mentioned who worked on Hebrew, he sent me a couple things this morning that might be relevant for the Swahili Arabic case, so I'm happy to pass those along. Any questions? I don't want to keep you from your lunch, though. Yeah.